If you have ever approached the King of Fighters series as a new player, there is something that you most likely will have heard or stumbled upon. KOF is hard. I am wondering though, how many people will have encountered an exact explanation of what might make the game hard to approach, if that is a hard truth at all? In this video, I will try and do just that by breaking down not only the aspects that supposedly make the game hard, but I would also do it in order of importance, at least in my opinion. Before you set your mentality on a why would anyone put with learning it then, there will be a section at the end highlighting the positives of learning KOF and what it can bring not only to the fighting games table, but also to your personal learning experience. Number 1. The meta. The most important factor and the biggest difference from most other fighting games is that KOF throws the meta at you instantly, right before you even have a concept of what the meta is. To explain this, if you watch two very competent KOF players play each other, you will notice that most likely the difference and the openings will come from a constant conversation and adaptation to each other's options. This is of course present in pretty much any fighting game, from a decent to competent level. But I would argue that it isn't something that you will be faced with and forced to use from your very first games in other titles, or at least not this consistently and somewhat brutally. SNK, however, has a habit of exposing the players of most of their games to the choices matter approach right off the bat, and this is especially evident in the reboot of Samurai Shodown, where a wrong choice can, in many cases, take away up to 80% of your life in a single touch. Fairly different from other more gradual approaches in other companies' flagship titles. Taking Street Fighter as an example, the usual patterns for beginners is to learn their best moves in a couple situations and a pretty abstract idea of a game plan, and then learn the game gradually from there. In KOF, even at a low level, if the opponent knows how to play KOF, you will be faced with a highly aggressive, fast, mix-up based approach that can be challenging to organically figure out, especially if unknowingly playing with approaches from other games, such as the classic playing Street Fighter in KOF. Admittedly, the wheel of mix-ups and the counters to them is something that players fully understand, hopefully, by the time they have some considerable experience, and sometimes not even then, due to many players not being used to lateral thinking. Being faced by this concept at pretty much every single interaction in KOF, due to the very nature of freedom and design of the game, running, multiple jumps, nature of backdashes, presence of rolls, and limited invincibility to shake off pressure, can feel really daunting, especially since you'll slam onto it when you're just learning how to move. On top of this, since meter is very important in KOF, both offensively and defensively, beginners will have a natural and understandable repulsion to use it defensively, since it isn't rare to be introduced to KOF with long combos that are enabled by meter, and new players will naturally want to execute those and feel pushed to land the opener that will grant them the combo. Due to the inability of a new player to fully grasp neutral and the game behind it, they will rarely use the meter-based defensive options such as a fully invincible guard cancel roll and a blowback. With limited invincibility but fast enough to be hard to punish, that will reset the game to neutral, granting the defender a breather. Being KOF neutral so unique, approaching it with experience from other games and not with an endemic rules to KOF will surely lead to disappointment. Many people stumble onto this, but due to the limited experience and or understanding of KOF rules, they may leave the game with somewhat undefined feelings of I'm not allowed to play, I don't like the neutral, I can't deal with or shake off pressure. Basic rules such as preventing people from jumping rather than try to anti-air them, whether with standing A's and far B's at close range or with alt B's offensively, are often the first ones that will be forgotten in the midst of the action. Number 2. The jumps. A huge aspect of KOF is its aerial nature, and at the same time the high reliance on jumps. This is a very unique factor, especially if structured around the 4 separate jumps, 5 counting the dynamics that a neutral jump adds, and also the substantial disconnect from the first dogma that will be imposed over new players in most other games: don't jump. While this is great advice for a beginner in many other games, in KOF this is the equivalent of asking someone to fly by ripping their wings off. Approaching KOF as its own game will be liberating for a beginner, due to how one of the first rules of other games that feels somewhat superimposed could theoretically be left at the door with a neatly written message in big bold letters: no thanks. In KOF, jumps are actually encouraged, even for beginners. When I say jumps, however, I mean the full array of jumps available, with hops, hyper hops, normal jumps, and super jumps, all having their distinct utility, especially when paired with air normals and, if your character has them, air specials and supers. Often beginners won't practice the different kind of jumps, maneuvers, such as tiger knee cancels, and don't get to understand how the same normal with the same jump, maybe back or forth, will perform completely different functions in the game meta. This lack of practice could be partly blamable on the easy execution of such a simple movement option in other games being non-existent, and the repeated limited jumping extremely easy to deal with for the most part. In KOF, however, this is the equivalent of walking back and forward to pick your ranges, and it happens at a much faster speed. If this is just the entry level when it comes to jumps and movement, the depth here is the understanding of how to maneuver against such a vast array of options, with often creative and unorthodox solutions. Whether it is by expecting a jump and jumping over it yourself, or running under it if it's high enough and tripping it from the other side. Not to be underestimated, running as a tool to pick your ranges is also often underused or forgotten, making the stationary character an easy target. To summarize it, without mastering movement and jumping, and the freedom they give you, you can't really play KOF, and there's a lot of beginners that will navigate the screen with mostly just jumps and by walking, falling prey to easy anti-airs from a breed of players that have got used to anti-air short tops going 1/6 of the time and based almost entirely on reads rather than the broad reaction time given by a full jump. With that also comes the idea of passive zones in which nothing happens that are much smaller overall in KOF. In many other games, being full screen and throwing a fireball won't be seen fully punished by a short run and a super jump full screen. Number 3. Execution. To tie back to the jumps, execution in KOF is ingrained into pretty much every aspect of the game, and it can make a big difference in gatekeeping the damage potential to be dished out once an opening happens. Windows are much tighter, lights feels like lights for the most part, they lack weight and frame advantage, and buttons are very height dependent, with overall not the most generous of active frames, with some notable exceptions. There are some specific rules in some specific games as well that need to be learned and taken in isolation, or generally, things that may be in several games but may be easier or harder depending on the entry of the series you're playing. Things such as post-run buffer timings, windows for bypasses, etc. To add to this, there is a phenomenon that is pretty much exclusive of KOF and can make new players easily confused: long cuts. Long cuts are longer ways to execute the same input as opposed to shortcuts that are shorter ways, and in KOFs are often a necessity to avoid input overrides. This can be puzzling for new players, which may already be struggling with the execution and will learn that to cancel the special of their character into another special when in max mode, they may need to use a long cut to avoid, for example, an accidental super cancel. Execution also doesn't come in isolation and is strictly coupled with the decision making required and the speed at which everything happens, which brings me to the next point. Number 4. The speed. Yeah, I missed stripes. The speed at which everything happens is also to be taken in consideration when trying to define what people may find hard in KOF. Not to say that KOF plays at the supersonic speed of hyper fighters, but the speed of action, coupled with how often the player is called upon their decision making, as well as executing things at that pace, can feel overwhelming at times. Gone are most of the inactive phases of players walking back and forth before picking up the opponent's habits and intentions. A process that in KOF happens regularly, at consistent, almost rhythm timings, and that is dynamic in both its application and its solutions. In some of the games, 98, the timer itself seems to be rushing you on, especially when coupled with the offensive nature of the game. Don't get me wrong, this aids the player in learning quick thinking, and learning in general is something that happens often in KOF, just not at a very comfortable pace, at least for most people. To close, defending against short tops, empty low, jump-ins is a matter of a few frames, which makes reacting to them online borderline impossible, especially on titles without rollback netcode. Number 5. Anti-airing. In KOF, it is largely, and some would say predominantly, an active aspect, especially since players are required mostly to air rather than passively anti-air, on the ground of anti-airing some stuff on reaction being impossible. Considering that a lot of players, even very good ones, in other games rarely problem solve with air-to-airing, you can add this aspect to the wheel of mix-ups and counters. With all the jumps and movement options available though, air-to-airing your opponent will put you in a much better position offensively than many other games, even against opponents with strong reversals and options, granting you a position in which you are very rarely at disadvantage after both characters' air recovery, making air-to-airing an option that can and will lead to strong mix-ups and pressure when landing. Now, imagine still being able to anti-air due to having a really good hard read, only to discover that in KOF, with the exception of 13 being juggle heavy, overall the damage you can dish out of anti-airs ain't that significant anyway, both in raw damage, knockdowns, and corner carry. The game often forces player back into neutral, which can be challenging due to the heavy lateral thinking needed to navigate it. Number 6. Invincibility. KOF games, and generally a lot of SNK fighters, don't come with substantial invincibility inbuilt in their options. It isn't rare to witness a new player overwhelmed by their opponent's tight and oppressive pressure attempt a desperation move, the name KOF gives to supers, on wake up, being confidently meted by their opponent and eat yet another full conversion. The Ps and most other reversals follow this rule, with few exceptions. The only fully invincible options across the board are common grabs, which make perfect sense in a game with so many jumps and movement options to maneuver around them. There are many tools in the game to avoid or shake up pressure, rolls, guard cancel blowbacks, guard cancel rolls, standing A to prevent people from jumping with close, but they aren't exactly what most players are used to from other games. Number 7. Learning 3 characters. This is most likely the biggest misconception about KOF and also the least relevant. As for other games that are heavily system-based, learning the system and getting comfortable with it is the priority here. Certainly, the character-specific execution will have to be ironed out, but there are plenty of somewhat easy choices and interesting playstyles that won't require too much tweaking when playing neutral phases. On top of this, you don't even have the hurdle of huge move lists to remember and skim through to figure out your best tools, as in KOF, most of the toolkit characters have carry out a function. Synergy also isn't too big of a factor. Sure, in many cases you will have to think, at least for long term, at character position in relationing to the meter building dynamics, but especially from a low to a somewhat competent level, the game is very permissive in its structure, allowing players to experiment and customize playstyles and positioning. Why should you learn it then? KOF and other SNK games at large, especially Samsho, are in my opinion the games that will most constantly challenge your decision making and the nerves associated to it, at a very high pace too. Samsho, when it came out, definitely put me in a position to think, whoa, I crumbled way more than I thought I would, and help me re-evaluate how good I am at playing under pressure. Playing meta way more and at a higher pace will improve your hard reads and hence the rate at which your reads will be right, allowing you to open your third eye and see beyond reality and into the future. This isn't a guarantee and I will not provide refund. I'm not gonna lie to you, it doesn't come easy, but damn, it is incredibly fun. You will feel like you're having a constant, meaningful conversation through neutral and adaptation, and will have a pretty large potential for self-expression through gameplay. I'm getting it now. In KOF is a beautiful feeling that always seems to lead to more. A bit like hitting cherries, and it's pretty easy with some help to identify the logical succession of someone's gameplay based on previous choices and situations. The series will undoubtedly make you a better player at the core aspect of fighting games. The mental aspect of competition, understanding and anticipating your opponent, and adapting on the fly to each other. I kinda feel like I am good at KOF would be a perfect answer to a job interview question such as, could you provide an example of a situation in which you were required to quickly and creatively problem solve under pressure? If you end up developing an interest in KOF, the community has been incredibly dedicated to helping new players with plenty of ready-made resources and is very responsive to specific advice requests as well as motivating. If you have enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my YouTube channel and share it around social media. Below the video, in the description section, I will link my KOF discords for 2K2UM and 15. Also, I am a professional fighting games coach and have a coaching service on MetaFi that is linked in the description. Feel free to DM me on Discord or Twitter to inquire about coaching and to ask about coaching discounts. More of these video essays are coming.